Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English, episode number 2, with guest Chris Hennemeyer, an international aid worker who has been volunteering in Ukraine the last 2 years and founded the organization In the Trenches, where he raises money for Ukrainian troops.
Look, I'm old enough to remember when, one sort of striking image or one horrific war crime was enough to galvanize the world's attention. Such a thing cannot happen today because we are bombarded by stories, by images. There's so many of them. It's like chaff that we can't focus on one thing.
Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English, episode number 2. We are here with Chris Hennemeyer. Chris is a senior international aid worker who has had a very interesting career going from disaster areas all over the world. And rather than me reading you his bio, I was hoping, Chris, maybe you could just give me a short version of, sort of a little bit of background about what you've been doing, the last few decades, I guess.
Sure. Happy to, Damien. Yeah, and thanks for having me on your podcast. As you probably know, I'm the son of a foreign service officer. So like my siblings, we were kind of brought up as nomads and moved every couple of years. So it wasn't a big stretch for me to decide that I wanted to pursue an international career. And so once I got out of college, I did what a lot of people did in my generation, which was to join the Peace Corps, and wound up in West Africa, in Ghana to be specific. And that led to, 30 years or so, mainly focused on Africa, often in man-made emergencies of various sorts, which is a euphemism for wars and conflicts of all kinds. So, ranging from the probably now long forgotten civil wars of West Africa and Liberia with Charles Taylor and Sierra Leone, to the first, what they call the First African World War, which was the Congolese War, which drew in about 10 different countries. I was kind of in the thick of that. I was in Rwanda during the genocide, one of, I think, only 3 Americans in the country at that particular time. Burundi during its civil war. Just kind of went on, and it was, I think, a useful career, certainly an interesting one. But after 3 or 4 decades of putting Band-Aids on the world's wounds, I was looking forward to retirement. And so, it was literally, I think, in February of 2022, as the Russians were rolling across the Ukrainian border, I was sitting at this table I'm at right now, filling out forms, getting ready to tap into my Social Security and my pension. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I knew I wasn't going to play golf or sit around and, contemplate pickleball. But I had no idea exactly what I was going to do. So, a terrible misfortune for Ukraine actually was something that called to me, and not totally by accident, because I had worked in Ukraine for a very short period of time in 2015, 3 months living in Kharkiv. And you, of course, will remember 2015 was the year after the Russians absorbed Crimea and then began their offensive in Donbass. And sitting in Kharkiv, which we still called Kharkov in those days, which is only 40 kilometers or something from the Russian border, there was a lot of speculation that they might make a play for that city. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but it did give me some exposure to Ukraine. And, I managed to travel around a number of places that are actually currently under Russian occupation, and to get to know Ukrainians a little bit. And, I really had zero experience in that part of the world. And I came away from it really quite impressed. I mean, I had such a great team, so many smart, capable, passionate young people. Um, and yeah, when I left in the middle of 2015, I harbored some warm memories of Ukraine. But I can't say that I sat there and thought about Ukraine every day, or pondered when I might return to Ukraine. And in fact, if this current iteration of the war hadn't happened, I may never have returned to Ukraine. But it did plant some kind of seed in me. So even though I have zero Ukrainian blood and I have no family connections, it's a place that's become incredibly important to me. And to put it simply, it's after having seen, I don't know, a dozen or more wars, this might be, one of two or three that I can look at and say this is an unambiguous case of good versus evil. And that's a luxury when you get to could be part of being on the right side. And if you have a chance to embrace that, you should.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it seems like that's definitely the case. The good versus evil here, and I think that's why Ukraine has had the support, especially
Mhm.
early on, that it has had, because it's such a clear-cut violation of what we uh, know as like modern, civil rules and all this. So I've heard other expats, who've come to Ukraine and I guess had these connections with people there, and they've sort of like fallen in love. And I went there for the first time. I mean, I grew up in the Ukrainian community in the States, but going there the first time, really during the Orange Revolution, it
Mhm.
was a life-changing moment for me, and I really fell in love with this culture and identity that I'd sort of grown up with. That was like my grandparents that had been, but became like a real life thing for me. And I've heard of other expats, once they go there, they just move there or want to spend more time there and really become pro-Ukraine. For me, it's not surprising that to hear you say that your time there during 2015 really like made a mark, because I've heard that I've
Yeah.
seen that happen before to people who had no connection to Ukraine previously, and then having gone there and sort of interacted with people and experienced the culture and the society, I've been like, oh, this is maybe not quite what I expected, and
Mhm.
in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And 2015 was a very different time, I think, in a lot of ways than it is today. I mean, today, despite the understandable war fatigue and the terrible casualties that Ukraine has taken, Ukrainians are a much more unified nation. They're a much more unified people than they were 10 years ago, without a doubt. In 2015, I remember sitting with my staff having, in some instances, very, very difficult and uncomfortable conversations about people that on the team that were perceived as being insufficiently patriotic or insufficiently anti-Russian or insufficiently Ukrainian in some, yet to be defined way. They were all part of the same team. They all had the same passports. They all spoke Russian in Kharkiv. But the things that have since played out, what does it mean to be Ukrainian? What does it mean to have a certain understanding of Ukrainian history, or to choose to speak the Ukrainian language rather than Russian, or to embrace Ukrainian cultural icons rather than the litany of great Russian writers and musicians and so on. These kinds of conversations were still, at least for me, in kind of an embryonic stage, and so it was interesting to see that. Now things are, I think, are much clearer now.
Well, the irony is that Putin has done more to build the Ukrainian identity than any Ukrainian president has successfully been able to accomplish. His tactics, have forced people to make a decision. Are you pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian? And a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the people who were pro-Russian or maybe ambivalent, but they just grew up in the Russian culture, said, "Fuck this! Like, we're
Mhm.
Ukrainian."
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, that his tactics have not won hearts and minds.
Exactly why so many people, probably the vast majority of people, including myself, never thought this full-fledged invasion would happen in 2022. I mean, we tallied up all of the potential downsides. The turning an entire nation of Ukrainians against their Russian cousins, strengthening NATO, ruining Russia's reputation for generations to come. The economic price Russians are paying, et cetera. And we said, there's no way anybody would do something so patently stupid. And yet here we are.
Yeah, I didn't think that the invasion he would actually invade either in the way he did, or maybe he'd do it covertly, like try to extend what they had been doing. But just this blatant, obvious invade, like I guess he believed his own propaganda, or
Mm-hmm.
like they believed that Ukrainians would welcome them for the most
Yep.
part,
Yep.
um, which like anyone who spent any decent amount of time in Ukraine could tell you that that's not going to happen.
No, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that's another conversation that took a while for me to fully grasp, which was um, early on in the current phase of Russian aggression. I essentially attributed everything to Putin and his entourage. And when I would post something, for example, on Facebook or LinkedIn, it would always be hashtag Putin's war crimes or something like that. And then I remember sitting actually in a basement in Kherson eating pizza with a local team of NGO workers. And Kherson's just a couple kilometers from the Russian lines, and they're lobbing mortars over into the city on a regular basis from the Russian side. And we got into this conversation about whether Putin and his horrible regime is responsible for this, or whether there's a broader blame for Russians in general. And the Ukrainians in the room were all unambiguous. They said, "No, this is a Russian war. This is something particular about the Russian psyche." And I said, "No, come on, let's be serious. Humans are humans. They're good, bad, etc. You can't tar all people with the same brush." But they made a compelling case, and the case was not an abstract one. Many of these people had relatives in Russia. Some had worked in Russia. All of them had, friends and connections in Russia. And I think, I don't know, I'm simplifying things a bit here, but I think to a certain degree, they felt so disrespected and so betrayed by these people that they had been told were their kith and kin for so long, only to discover that that wasn't the case. And I think there's sort of no dismay, no disappointment greater than that of a person or a people that have been felt to be betrayed. That we were utterly wrong about our neighbors. Um, and there's, in their view, collective guilt.
Well, I think they were always had a colonial mentality towards Ukraine, it was like Little Russia,
Yeah.
or the Ukrainian language was a peasant language, so there was
Mhm.
always this like superiority, and how could they, be separate from our empire?
Right.
And really believing, the propaganda that was pushed to them was like that the West was orchestrating everything, all these demonstrations that happened over the years. People were paid, like the CIA was involved on the Maidan. This
Mhm.
was an American sponsored coup d'etat. And so like they didn't connect the dots that like, no, this was the will of the people living
Yeah.
there. This is what they wanted, and I think Putin also believed that. But yeah, so it's that the whole society has this mentality of colonialism, and also like insecurity, I think, since the Soviet Union collapsed, and some
Mhm.
trauma from that. and trying to regain that prestige. And Ukraine was, an integral part of that composition. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors at play.
Sure.
Yeah.
And let's not forget all the secret biolabs that are on every street corner in Ukraine, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Russian propaganda has really brainwashed a lot of the Russian population because they do listen to TV more than anything. And it's convincing. I mean, it works. If you start watching Russian propaganda, all of a sudden you're like, wait a second. If you're bombarded with that all the time,
there are no
you usually find a kernel of truth, and then they exaggerate a bunch of lies around it. So, yeah,
as they have done on social media in this country as well. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. There are any number of Americans that believe outlandish things too that they simply have seen on the internet.
Yeah. No, it's become a problem here as well.
Yeah.
But I guess the Soviets have been doing it for decades,
Right.
and Russia just sort of already had that base to work off of.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's get to your time in Ukraine. Since the war started. When did you decide to go back, and where did you land, and what was your mission there? What did you want to do?
Right. So, we go back to February 2022. I'm sitting here looking at my laptop. Lo and behold, tanks moving across the border into Ukraine. And I think, again, like many people, I assume that if this was a serious invasion, it was not going to be one that the Ukrainians would withstand for a very long time. I felt bad about that, but I would never have predicted that we would still be in a war 2.5 years on, with no end in sight. Never. So, the best I could do was sort of pay attention, and every instinct in my body was saying, Chris, get on a plane and go to Ukraine, see if you can do something useful. But since I just announced to my girlfriend that I had retired and, I was going to be spending a lot more time with her, it didn't seem like the ideal time to announce that I was going to be disappearing off to a war zone. So I kept my peace and, compulsively watched videos about Ukraine. Probably for about 6-7 months. And then one day she walked in and she saw me sitting there, and she's just folded her arms and kind of stared at me and said, you just need to go to Ukraine. And I said, oh, thank you very much. So I bought a ticket, I guess, so right at the beginning of January 2023. So we're already like 11 months into the war, and flew to Warsaw. Got it that long train ride from Warsaw to Kyiv, which I don't know, whatever that was, 13, 14 hours. And I had a handful of connections in Kyiv, but I didn't really know what I was going to do or where I was going to go. I did have, of course, these many decades of experience in humanitarian response work, but I didn't really want to do what I'd been doing in the past. I'd grown a bit jaded about the international humanitarian sector, which I felt was kind of bloated and costly and self-serving and not agile enough or fast enough and responding to needs. So I was quite clear to me that I didn't want to do that, nor did I want to get paid to do anything. I felt like, I needed to make a contribution to Ukraine, not make money off Ukraine's suffering. So, I kind of poked around, and people didn't know what to do with me. I mean, I was a fairly senior guy in my sector, and I wanted to get my boots dirty, and it was unclear how, a guy who doesn't speak Russian or Ukrainian and didn't really know the country particularly well was going to add any value. So, long story short, I got in touch with a friend of mine who happened to be living in Odessa, working for an international NGO, and he said, "Come on down here. I'll find something for you to do." So he did with his international NGO, and predictably, it didn't work out particularly well. We're still very good friends, but I didn't much like working for his organization. But fortunately, I was connected to some local Ukrainian NGOs and little tiny groups of, a dozen people. Some of them had been civil society activists or anti-corruption activists, and they just retooled themselves to help deliver assistance to communities right along the front line in the southeast. So from Odessa, at that point you go to Mykolaiv, or you go to Kherson, or you go further up the river to Kharkovka. And there are all kinds of little communities out there that had been decimated by fighting with the Russians, and were kind of deprived of basic needs, medicines, foods, clothing, etc. So I joined these small NGOs, and because I had, decades of experience, I could help them raise money, raise awareness, assess security needs, help them with logistics and so on. So that was great. And it was really fun working with, young sort of dynamic groups of people that weren't tied down in bundles of bureaucracy. They just wanted to get things done. So I was, renting a little apartment in Odessa, which your listeners may or may not know is really one of the prettiest cities. It's just a gorgeous place sitting there right on the Black Sea, all of these 19th century Belle Epoque buildings. It has a whole vibe that's so different from any other place, I think, in Ukraine. And Ukrainians know that, and so do Russians, for that matter. Everybody kind of, starts glowing when they talk about Odessa. I remember the first time I went down there, I was checking out of my hotel in Kyiv, and the people at the front desk said, "So, where are you off to?" And I said, "I'm going down to Odessa," and they all kind of went, Odessa, and they were right. So yeah,
it's got the Odessa Film Festival, which is Ukraine's biggest film festival. I've been there a couple times.
Okay.
It has a rich art history.
Yes.
In Ukraine, as well as just being like having the beaches and that lifestyle also. But yeah, a lot of Jewish population there is pretty big, and I think like there's some famous
Bob
like Hollywood
Dylan's
people
ancestors came from there.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah. I mean, there are Jews from Odessa who have had an impact all over the world, culturally and politically, and so on. So yeah, it's a very cool place and very unusual. And as I say, it's a good jumping off spot to try and provide assistance to places further east, because although Odessa hasn't really been threatened by any kind of Russian incursions since the early days of the war, you don't have to go very far. You only have to drive a few hours, and you really only have to drive about 2 hours just south of Mykolaiv, down in the Kinburn Spit, and you're very close to Russian lines. So I did that for most of 2023. I guess I spent about 6 months in Ukraine during that period, which is about the maximum I could do and still hope to retain my relationship with my beloved. And then I was lying around one very cold evening in my apartment in Odessa, and I thought, I'm glad I'm not in a trench. And then I started thinking about these guys who were sitting in trenches, in the mud and the cold and the ice. And I thought, it's good that I've been able to deliver humanitarian aid, but I think I could make more of a difference if I were to provide some assistance to the military, which is, very much a kind of a seismic shift in my mind, because my entire career has been a humanitarian side. And, if you were to suggest to an international NGO that you start supporting the military, you'd be drummed out in no time at all. These two things are supposed to be kept completely separate. But very few people feel that way in Ukraine, if anybody. And I certainly didn't feel that way. So I sent off an email to friends and family and said, can we raise some money and try and buy these frontline soldiers some very basic things to keep them keep their morale up as they sit in these cold, muddy trenches. And within, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, I think I had about $8,000. So I ran out and started buying, things that people could use, big charging stations, even though they're sitting in trenches like World War I soldiers. Their communications run through Starlink terminals run by Elon Musk, and they're using DJI drones made in China, and they're making calls on Samsungs and iPhones and so on. So they're modern people who need power. And, there's nothing more depressing than being deprived of power. You can't talk to your loved ones, and you can't surveil the enemy. And so getting some things like power banks seemed to make sense. And then from there, it went on. So, I created a little website for this charity of mine, which literally consists of me, no one else. And it's called inthetrenchesukraine.org. And in the past, I guess, 11, 12 months, I've raised about $40,000. I wish it was more, but it's not too bad. And with that, I've been able to buy lots of trauma medical kits for frontline medics, drone parts, tires for vehicles, construction materials for trenches, warm clothing, body armor, you name it. And this is all kind of responding to needs of specific little military units. I don't kind of wake up and decide what to buy. I get text messages and somebody says, look, we really need this. Give you an example. This morning, I woke up to a couple of quite disturbing text messages. One was a video from a friend of mine of a half a dozen Ukrainian soldiers that had just been attacked in a bunker up in Donetsk, I think up near Vuhledar, which has just been taken by the Russians. And these guys were all wounded. One guy had lost part of his hand, another guy had a head wound, another guy had leg wounds, and they had tourniquets on and so on. But the message was these guys have just been evacuated to Odessa for hospitalization, so that was good. But that they were using these really poor quality Chinese tourniquets that are ineffective. And unfortunately, they're used widely among Ukrainian military forces and Russians for that matter, because they're very cheap, but they're garbage. So I quickly sent some money to a friend in Odessa who ordered a bunch of tourniquets from a Ukrainian company that actually makes quite good tourniquets in Ukraine. So, these kinds of things pop up all the time. Last week, I got a request for drone parts from a drone unit down in Kherson, and, for $500, I could send them enough to cobble together some more drones. So, I know when we talk about military assistance to Ukraine, people think in terms of billions of dollars and enormously complex supply chains. And of course, that's what the war runs on. But I think there is a useful role for little organizations like mine to fill in these gaps.
You're connecting. You've from your first time there, you've made these relationships with the various battalions or contacts in the army from doing the humanitarian aid. So that's so who these people are and they know who you are. So there's a trust there, and so they reach out to you and right. So you've built this sort of system for making in the trenches through like having us spent that time there initially, which
exactly.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, I can't overstate how important it is to these guys if somebody, a guy like me from the States, from Washington, D.C., gets in a car, drives a few hours and winds up in their little drone base, a mile and a half from the Russian lines. And, they are they don't get many visitors. They certainly don't get many foreign visitors. They don't get very many visitors from, high-ranking officers in their own army. They're kind of left in many cases to their own devices. So when somebody shows up, it's not just because they're bringing them some useful items that they need. It's an acknowledgement that they're doing something really important. They're out there at the tip of the spear, often, kind of in miserable conditions and, a bit neglected, a bit ignored. And so when they get a visit, it's super important to them, and it builds a real bond between them and in this case me, and my Ukrainian friends that accompany me on these things. Because I should say right away that there are lots of Ukrainians doing this kind of thing. I mean, people will point to videos of Ukrainians in nightclubs and driving Lamborghinis down the street and say, "What are these people up to? They're not serious about this war." But I know other Ukrainians, and these are guys that men and women that use their own money and their own time and put their lives at risk to drive to horribly dangerous places and deliver everything from giant pots of borscht to warm socks to drones, and they do this constantly.
Yeah, that was the spirit on the Maidan. That was how, those demonstrations in the center of Kyiv functioned. Was there was a whole infrastructure of volunteers that were bringing food and supplies and what was needed, and it was like the self-organized, like its own system. And that's just expanded when the war started. I mean, in Donbass, like people started doing that there, and I mean, there's always a percentage of the population, I guess, that's going to be that active. I would say It's probably a higher percentage in Ukraine than maybe some other places would be. But yeah, that's what made Ukraine sort of unique. That I think that they really like believe in the cause of having a free country, an independent country, and a country that functions in the democratic world. Like this is something that they believe for their children, for the next generation. It's like that they're willing to die for that, which, when I saw that, that's why I named my film Freedom or Death, because that's what I saw in the eyes of the people then and there, that they were willing to do that. Or there was enough of them willing to do that.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that kind of commitment and organization will pay dividends for a couple of more generations, because you have that organizational stuff that happened in Maidan. You had it again during the first phase of the full-fledged invasion in Crimea and Donbass, where all of these little organizations started flourishing. And now you have it at a much greater scale. And one day this war will be over, and those people will still remain committed to building a better Ukraine, but they'll do it in different ways. They'll be calling out corrupt politicians. They'll be starting their own political parties. They'll be running rehabilitation centers. They'll be providing mental health. They'll be writing novels and books. They'll be doing all kinds of things that will have an impact on Ukrainian society after this war is over, with the skills they learned during the war.
Yeah, I'm curious, like what were some interactions that you had with soldiers? Like, what is their morale like, or what is their added feelings about where things are recently? I mean, are they happy with the support? Do they wish they had more support? Like, I don't know, maybe you can share some sort of insights that you've had just sort of on in these, one-on-one interactions. Like, what's your sense of their state of mind?
I guess, there are a couple things that are universal about soldiers, no matter what army they're in, right? One is soldiers like to gripe a lot and to piss and moan. And Ukrainian soldiers are no different than anybody else in that sense. And the other thing is, soldiers, I think, generally speaking, don't tend to look at things in kind of a broad perspective. Their real commitment, their real interest is their own little unit. They're there because a dozen other guys are there. Not because they love the Minister of Defense or the brigade commander. Their loyalty is to their little, band of brothers is the term, right? And so from that perspective, I think there's still a lot of strong morale in the Ukrainian armed forces. And I can talk about guys from very elite units, special forces units that are highly trained and really get the best equipment and so on, all the way down to territorial brigades that are kind of like National Guard units that get next to nothing. And I would say all of these units have a lot of cohesion and a lot of sort of unit loyalty. In addition, I'd say that they are much better equipped over the last year than they were in the first year of the war. In the first year of the war, systems were bad. People weren't getting warm clothing. Their sleeping bags were terrible. They just the procurement and quartermastering system wasn't working for them. So most Ukrainian soldiers did, and many still do, equip themselves. You don't want to rely upon the lowest cost bidder to provide you with body armor if you can go out and buy some good body armor with some money from your friends and family. Again, I don't think that's particularly special about Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, American soldiers did the same thing in the Gulf War because they were unhappy with the kind of protection they were getting from their Pentagon supplied equipment. Having said that, I mean, there are some huge structural problems in the Ukrainian army that will come as no surprise to you or anybody else that pays attention to this stuff. I mean, it's still very much an old army, old in the sense that, these guys are old. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is something like 44, which is insane. And that's a function of I think just a complicated political system in Ukraine that has prevented the government from really ramping up conscription to the degree that it needs to be. And, I don't pretend to understand all the nuances of it, and I'm utterly sympathetic to somebody who does not want to be grabbed off the street, thrown in the army, and 4 days later, with very little training, find themselves in the middle of, a meat grinder up in Donbass. But you don't win wars by running them that way. And I think, Ukraine has to decide, if it's going to get serious about conscription, because when you're fighting an enemy with 4.5 times your population, even if you kill 3 times as many of them, it is still a corrupt government in many ways, much less so, I think, than it has been in its post, Soviet history. But you don't have to look at too many Ukrainian newspapers to see yet another corruption scandal blowing up in another ministry. There are all kinds of groups tracking that. The Ukrainian media has been very aggressive in calling out corruption. So I think they're beginning to get their hands around this problem, but it's still a problem, and I don't think we do anybody a service by denying that it's a problem. So you can look at Ukraine on any given day and say it's a good day or a bad day for the war. I mean, there are days when I wake up and I think, oh, Christ, the Ukrainian forces lost another town yesterday. 70% of the power grid has been knocked out. The Americans still won't give approval to the Ukrainians to use long-range missiles against Russian targets in Russia. What the hell is going on? On the other hand, if I take a deep breath and look at things a little more rationally, I can say much of the much of the media focus that we've seen over the last year has been on a tiny little part of Ukraine where things are not going particularly well. We could start with Bakhmut, then we move to Avdiivka, then we move to Chasiv Yar, then we move to Vuhledar, then we move to Pokrovsk. All of these places are like within 90 miles of one another.
Well, that's where the control of territory is changing.
Yeah. And the Russians have made some progress there, but it's progress on a very micro scale. I'm looking at the map of Ukraine behind you. Ukraine is an immense place, and there's a little tiny piece of it that's being ferociously fought over, and lots of men are dying there on both sides, and that's tragic as hell. But it's not a sign that the Ukrainian lines are about to collapse, and the Russian army is going to sweep the country and take over. Far from it. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't continue to need more help. I mean, we're kind of getting into these 30,000-foot issues here, but it's no great secret that Ukrainians are paying a lot of attention to the U.S. presidential elections. They're very worried about the prospect of another Trump presidency, as they should be. The Europeans, on any given day can be fairly strong or fairly wobbly. It depends upon what perspective you're looking at. But yeah, I think Ukraine deserves better allies, I guess I would say.
So one of the things that comes to my mind, especially when looking at that situation, is sort of like, you don't really hear people say it, but it's like Ukrainian lives aren't as valuable as the lives of Americans or West Europeans. Sure. So the Ukrainian civilians are getting killed and hit by these Russian bombs, but Ukraine can't shoot into Russia where some of these rockets are coming from. Mm-hmm. And the justification, I guess, is because that could lead to an escalation, which can endanger down the line in some potential future our citizens. So I don't know, like how do you see that? Like and you've probably seen this throughout your career where lives aren't as valuable of a certain people or society as they are elsewhere, which goes into like, okay, survival of the fittest and survivalist mentality, which is human nature. But you've obviously like spent your career caring about some of these less valuable lives. So I'm curious, like what your take is on it, and how do you perceive it through your own work and experiences, like caring about these lives that are less valuable, for, to be blunt.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very different perspective. As you pointed out, I come out of the humanitarian world, and when I think about Ukraine, I don't think about this geographic landmass that sits between Russia and Poland and is this strategic linchpin in European security. Those are not thoughts that interest me particularly. Those are the things that Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin and so on are paid to think about. And good. I'm glad somebody's thinking about this stuff and not, blithely dragging us down the path to nuclear Armageddon. On the other hand, when I think about Ukraine, I think about Misha and Sasha and Denis, Lena, Lesya, and all of these individual Ukrainians that I know who are, in some cases, going to sleep while Shahid drones are hitting their neighborhood, are stressed out from lack of sleep for 2.5 years, are unsure where their next paycheck is coming from. This is the real human cost of war. So I personally feel like we need a much more aggressive policy vis-a-vis Russia. And I got to say, I'm deeply disappointed that this administration in Washington has been so cautious, almost to the point of cowardice at times. And I hope that whoever wins the White House will be less so, but I'm not convinced of it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with Ukrainians, carrying their own water. And some of their allies have understood this. For example, the Danes, who have been remarkably generous in terms of providing assistance to Ukraine, particularly military assistance, are investing in Ukrainian arms productions. Germans are as well. Rheinmetall has a partnership now in Ukraine. This will take a while to pay dividends, but eventually, Ukraine will, I think, be able to produce its own howitzers, its own armored personnel carriers, its own long-range missiles in sufficient quantity to make a difference. But in order to get to that point, they still have to survive the next winter and the next spring. So, yeah, my crystal ball has been very foggy since the beginning, Damien. I got to tell you, I mean, I would have predicted that the war would have been over after a few months, and then I would have predicted after a year, and here we are, more than 2.5 years later. So I'm reluctant to launch any bold predictions at this point, since I've been so consistently wrong. But I don't have any fear that Ukraine, that big, enormous territory behind you, is going to become Russian. I do think, though, that there will inevitably be compromises over territory before there's a peace deal. I think the notion that not 1 square meter of Ukrainian land must remain in Russian hands is a crazy fantasy. It's not going to happen. Ukraine's going to lose some land, and that'll be the price to pay for some sort of peace. And it will be a festering wound for years to come, as it is in so many other places in the Russian Empire, whether it's, Georgia or Ingushetia or whatever. So it's not a great outcome, but I think eventually that's where we'll wind up.
Yeah. Well, I think next year is going to be a crucial year after the elections, and seeing how Ukrainians' infrastructure holds up through the winter, and the Russian economy also. I sort of feel like at some point, they just can't keep up the pace that they have been keeping up. But what do I know? I'm not an economist.
Well, I think, I hope you're right. I mean, I heard a report today that said that in the next budget that's being batted around in the Council of Ministers in Moscow, I think something like 32% is supposed to be dedicated to the military. And it's such a stunningly huge number that even some ministers are saying, we've gone too far. We can't sustain this level of investment to the detriment of the rest of the economy. They will, of course, not be listened to and probably be sidelined. But I think eventually these sanctions will start biting even harder. It'll be hard for Russia to keep this up. But also, it'd be hard for them to keep it up demographically. I mean, we don't know how many people the Ukrainians lost, although certainly they've lost more than they would admit to. But I think it's pretty clear that there's at least 600,000 dead and wounded Russians, which is a staggering figure. Staggering when you compare it to any other conflict Russia's been in since the Second World War.
The former Ukrainian general said any other country, that amount of casualties would have stopped the war by now.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. The United States would have stopped the war with 1% of those casualties. Um, but yeah, we shall see. I mean, it is. While I pray for a Ukrainian victory, honestly, I can't help but feel pain for all of those Russians who are dying as well. I mean, it is a tragedy on both sides of the line, and it's difficult to yeah, it's difficult to blame some illiterate kid from Kamchatka who decides that, he wants to make a few $1,000, um, and then, is killed or wounded. There's no good outcome there. It's all bad.
Yeah, well, they're still signing up to fight, even
Yeah,
though they
yeah,
know that it's a war, and they know that it's probably at this point not quite the way it's been presented to them in
right.
the mainstream Russian media. But
Sure,
yeah, so
sure.
I don't have too much pity for personally for those guys, because they're going there to get a paycheck and you know kill Ukrainians basically.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. No, I get it. I guess pity's not the right word. I just view it as just a tremendous waste, just so unnecessary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's definitely. Uh, I feel like there's sort of like a slaves to the system there,
Mhm.
uh, in
Yeah,
in some way. In some
yeah,
way, they don't have much options. It's convenient to take these guys who are kept poor, uneducated, fed propaganda, and just be able to utilize them.
yep,
You
yep.
know,
Cannon fodder.
yeah.
Yeah. In the meantime, ordinary Ukrainians are trying to go about their lives, and you see the news just as I do. I think it was yesterday, 6 people were killed when a missile hit the central market in Kherson. People killed in Zaporizhia, I think. Some casualties in Kharkiv. Um, yeah, none of these have any military utility. They're simply designed to keep Ukrainians nervous and off base.
So this happens, like you said, pretty often, these types of incidents. And you, having been there and having a relationship, it may have more resonance for you, like it does with many Ukrainians abroad. But what's your sense of, how does it resonate with other Americans, or maybe people in your circle that you're trying to raise money from? Like, because the sense is that, this happens so frequently that it's just become something that the shock has worn off. People are
Yeah,
desensitized to it. It
yeah.
doesn't have like the impact of, it's just like, okay, it's just become a regular occurrence, really, you know, and people have to go about their lives, and it's just happening in the background. And, that initial sort of shock, that and empathy seems to have dissipated. I mean, how are you finding it, in your circle and your network, and trying to raise money and engage with people to care?
No, you've summed it up very well. I mean, it's very hard. Look, I'm old enough to remember when, one sort of striking image or one horrific war crime was enough to galvanize the world's attention. I think back to the famous 1984 Ethiopian famine. And, anybody that has picked up a picture book of Africa has probably seen that horrifying picture of like a spindly kid sitting on, the baked earth, and there's a vulture in the background.
Mm, yeah.
That photo really opened the floodgates of assistance to Ethiopia during that famine. I mean, it changed the world's perception. Such a thing cannot happen today because we are bombarded by stories, by images. There's so many of them. It's like chaff that we can't focus on one thing. I mean, sometimes I'll turn on the news and yeah, whatever. There'll be an orphanage that's been hit by an Onyx missile, and there are 12 dead Ukrainian kids, and I'll think, maybe that's the one that will that will allow us to focus on the real human tragedy here. But no, there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one, and they all kind of blend into background noise. And all the more so when, of course, the world's attention is focused on what's going on in the Middle East, which is, equally horrible. So I think rather than make choices, people just decide the world is far too confusing and frightening for me. I'm worried about climate change. I'm worried about another Trump presidency. I'm worried about nuclear war. I'm worried about this, that, and the other. Let me just watch some Netflix. Yeah, so that makes it tough to raise money. I have kind of a core group of people that are very engaged, and they, for whatever reason, I think many of them really do see this as kind of a latter-day version of the Spanish Civil War, if you will. One of those clear-cut cases where totalitarianism could have been stopped in its tracks if we'd moved a little faster and been a little firmer. But, unfortunately, I can't count on thousands of people writing me a check every month. So I do what I can with what I get, and that forces me to make, hard decisions. There's a guy, for example, that I know quite well from Odessa, a drone commander who was badly wounded about 6 months ago. He's been in a military hospital in Mykolaiv since then. His leg is not healing properly. And I would like to take some of that money and get him better medical care. If I do that, that means I can't invest in other kinds of equipment for units that are defending the country from the Russians. I wish I didn't have to make those kinds of choices, but I do. So anyway, I'm grateful that you got me on here, because maybe somebody will send me a check and I could do both. Yeah.
Well, that's why I want to say, if someone that's listening to this wanted to support you, how could they do that? How can they find you?
Thanks. Yeah. So if they go to my website, I think that's the best thing. Go to www.inthetrenchesukraine, all one word, lowercase, .org, inthetrenchesukraine.org. On the landing page, there's a QR code for PayPal. There's a QR code for Venmo, which most Americans will know. And then a little further down, I've put information for things like Zelle and Wise, which is used by a lot of Europeans. So there are ways. It's not the world's friendliest and most user efficient website, but it's the best a 68-year-old guy like me could come up with. But the QR codes are there, so yeah, it would be great. I mean, just to reiterate, not a penny of this goes into my pocket. I mean, when I go to Ukraine, I pay my own ticket. I buy my own food. I take my own cabs. I pay my own apartment. And I put my own money into it. I mean, I've put, I don't know, I probably put about $5,000 of my own money into this thing, aside from my travel costs. So, I work for free. There's no overhead. There's no, nobody's making any money off this. It's every penny goes straight to Ukrainian troops.
Well, I'm sure they're very grateful for your efforts and your presence there. And thank you for making the time to talk with us today. I'm glad we were able to have this conversation, and finally in real time and in person. We're going to chat with your brother in a upcoming episode, who's also a passionate Ukraine supporter. And I don't know, I'm kind of curious, is there anything in your upbringing, that you think maybe was instilled in you guys early on? Because Paul had mentioned, some like your father was sort of like a Cold War warrior. Like he grew up during the time when the Soviet Union was really like, enemy number one for America, and he was a diplomat, right? So
yeah, No, absolutely. No, you of course you'll have a great conversation with Paul, and he's got another focus, which is Ukraine's energy sector, which I know you will talk about because that's such an important issue, and he comes out of that sector. That's where he spent his career. So I think you'll have a fun chat. In terms of whether we became Latter-day Cold Warriors because of my dad, I don't know. I mean, he certainly was of that generation. Maybe more importantly, he was in the U.S. Army in the Second World War, and so he landed in Normandy, and he walked across France and Belgium and Holland and Germany, and it's just a lowly corporal, usually marching on his boots or driving an old truck, but he did his job, and in one instance he did something vaguely heroic, which I won't go into details, but he received the French Legion of Honor award for that. So I think we sort of hunger for an opportunity to do something useful and to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves. I think it's true of most human beings, right? What we fear most is not doing something important, not being on the right side of history. And as I said, I think earlier on, if you have that opportunity, and look, everybody has that opportunity right now. We could all decide to be on the right side of history and support Ukraine. We don't all have to go there. We don't have to pick up a gun, but we can write a letter to our congressman. We can write a check to a charity. We could do any number of things so that there's a little check mark next to our name saying, when times got hard, somebody did something useful. So, that'd be my message to leave.
It's an inspiring one, and hopefully it will motivate someone who's listening to this to maybe make that extra effort to just pick up the phone or send an email or send a couple bucks your way.
Thanks a lot, Damien. Yeah, no, and great chatting with you. You make it very easy to talk, and hope we touch base either here in Washington at some point, or in Munich where you are, or in Ukraine.
Coming up in episode 3, we will meet Petro Rondyak, an Ukrainian American who has lived in Kyiv with his family since the 1990s. Petro has been one of the key people managing Wiener Ford, one of the biggest car dealerships in Ukraine, and continues leading Wiener Group Ukraine through wartime.